This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 728 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Now that the season is close to coming to an end, this 15 transaction show is going to focus entirely on ads, drops, and holds. No more buys and sells. So it's a quicker show than normal, but hopefully that makes things a little bit more useful. Now, before getting into those transactions this week, I want to remind you that with basketball season going strong, FanDuel and Buzzer plan on giving you a chance to win big with their daily fantasy basketball contest. Introducing the NBA Clutch Shot presented by Buzzer, an NBA DFS contest taking place every Wednesday from now until March that gives you a chance to win a share of FanDuel's biggest prize pool. Simply construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap, and then follow along as the games unfold using FanDuel's live scoring feature. Earn points for points scored, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks, and watch as your lineup climbs the ranks. The higher up the leaderboard your lineup finishes, the more cash you'll win. It's that simple. The contest is live, so visit FanDuel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1 and submit your lineups now. That's FanDuel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1. Add Zach Moss. So Jonathan Taylor has a high ankle sprain. That means we're going to see a lot of Zach Moss and probably Deion Jackson too during the final 2 weeks of the fantasy season. Now, since that Jonathan Taylor injury occurred early in Indianapolis' game against Minnesota, we have a full game sample size of the Colts using Zach Moss and Deion Jackson. And it was mostly the Zach Moss show. He played 67% of Indy's offensive snaps. Deion Jackson was at 32%. And Zach Moss had a 42% success rate. That's not bad. He finished the day with 24 carries and a 65% running back rush share. Now, I will say this. There's definitely some concern about Zach Moss's pass-catching upside. But the Colts do get the Chargers in Week 16. And LA is a top 10 fantasy matchup for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. They've given up the second most rushing yards to running backs this year. So it would make sense for the Colts to feature their ground game in this matchup. And that would benefit Moss a little bit more than Jackson, at least based on what we saw in Week 15. Add Tyler Algier. So Falcons running back Caleb Huntley had a bad ankle injury on Sunday. And even though Huntley doesn't typically see a huge workload in that backfield, he's still a back that's part of that really obnoxious rotation. And his injury did open things up a tad for Tyler Algier. Algier had 53% of Atlanta's running back rushes. That was his highest running back rush share since Week 7. And in Week 7, Cordero Patterson wasn't active. Algier made the most of his opportunity. He ran the ball 17 times for 139 yards and a touchdown. Now the Falcons in Week 16, they get a tough one against Baltimore. But in Week 17, they'll get a Cardinals team that ranks as the 5th best matchup for running backs in adjusted points allowed. So Tyler Algier could be really usable there. Hold Zonovan Knight. So after 3 straight RB2 plus performances for Bam Knight, he fell back to earth in Week 15. He carried the ball 13 times, and he had just 23 yards on the ground against the Lions. And he didn't see a single target. If you want some good news, he did still see 77% of New York's running back rushes. That's a number that's right in line with his previous games. And Detroit has been pretty good against running backs. They haven't allowed a top 20 running back performance since Week 7. Upcoming for New York are contests against the Jags and the Seahawks. According to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method, no team has a better schedule for running backs than the New York Jets in Week 16 and 17. So don't get rid of Bam Knight. Add Juwan Johnson. So almost every fantasy football manager right now needs tight end help. So Juwan Johnson makes sense as an add this week. He's ranked as a top 8 tight end in 5 of his last 7 games. And that's largely thanks to touchdowns. He scored 7 times during that stretch. And while some of that is definitely fluky, he's coming off a game where he saw 32% target share. He's got a 16% target share per game during this insane stretch. And at the end of the day, which tight end is not relatively touchdown dependent anyway? So go ahead and add Juwan Johnson. Add Marquise Goodwin. So Tyler Lockett broke his finger in Week 15. The Seahawks fortunately got a very optimistic review of that injury, but there's a very good chance that he misses Week 16. I just can't say for certain because he hasn't been rolled out officially. And this Week 16 game is a big one for him to miss because the Seahawks get the Chiefs. The Chiefs rank as a top 10 matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Unsurprisingly, Kansas City has faced one of the highest pass rates in the league this year. Because teams are trailing against them, they have to throw the ball. That's all good news for Seattle pass catchers. And that includes Tyler Lockett's probable replacement, Marquise Goodwin. Goodwin has played as Seattle's number 3 wide receiver all year. He gets a big bump in Week 16 without Tyler Lockett. Add Royce Freeman. So look, you're going to hear Royce Freeman's name not only on this show, but other podcasts you probably listen to too. He's a very generic add this week. Because against Kansas City on Sunday, he ran the ball 11 times. That was the most in the Houston backfield. And he was by far their most effective runner. But I'm not that excited to add a Houston Texans running back right now. He had a 58% running back rush share and just a 3.7% target share. And most importantly, he was actually outsnapped by Dare Ogunbowale. And chances are, in Week 16, you're not going to feel good about using Royce Freeman against the Titans. But you might want to add him because you could hypothetically build some confidence in him if he has a good outing against Tennessee. Because then in Week 17, Houston gets Jacksonville. That's a good matchup. So if Freeman does well this week, you might be able to play him next week. It's just going to be really tough to trust him here in Week 16. Add or hold Chris Moore. So this transaction's an add or a hold because I talked about Chris Moore last week. And he had a pretty mediocre outing in Week 15. So as a result, you might be tempted to drop him, but don't. He saw a 33% target share against the Chiefs. And that target share is coming after he saw a 46% target share back in Week 14. And as I just noted, in Week 16 and 17, the Texans get the Titans and Jags. Those are 2 top 5 matchups for fantasy wide receivers. You have to keep a close eye on the Texans injury report with Brandon Cooks and Nico Collins, but if they can't go, Chris Moore is definitely in play. Add Daniel Jones. Now, typically a player like Daniel Jones would not get a shout out on this podcast because of his percent roster number. It's at 59% over on Yahoo. But it's Week 16, things are not typical. The Giants get the Vikings this week. That game has a decent 47.5 point over-under. Now, Minnesota was fine enough against Matt Ryan this past week from a fantasy perspective, but Indianapolis was also playing with a really positive game script. The Vikings are still a top 10 matchup for quarterbacks. And we know that Danny Dimes can get it done with his legs. He's averaged over 41 rushing yards per game this year. So he makes for a decent streaming play if he's available. Drop Deontay Foreman. Now look, I understand that a lot of you can't afford dropping a running back who's seeing volume in his offense. But in shallower leagues, I think an argument can be made that Deontay Foreman should be dropped. He's coming off a terrible game against the Steelers. He ran the ball 10 times, he had 9 yards, and he didn't see a target. He did have a really strong 71% running back rush share, but he's been losing work to Chuba Hubbard. Foreman saw just a 30% snap share in Week 15. That's his lowest snap share since Christian McCaffrey was traded. And it may not get that much better. In Week 16 and 17, the Panthers faced the Lions and the Buccaneers. I already talked about it earlier, but the Lions have been great against running backs during the second half of the season. Tampa Bay is the 6th toughest matchup for running backs according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, it's understandable if you'd rather not drop Foreman, but like I said, I think there's an argument there, especially in shallower leagues. Add Brock Purdy. So when a quarterback's got the right system and when he's got the right weapons, he can be stream-worthy in fantasy football. Sometimes it's that simple. Brock Purdy has scored 14.3, 21.7, and 16.5 fantasy points across his 3 starts. He's thrown multiple passing touchdowns in each game. Now, I hate to be that guy, but he has been at least a little bit fortunate. He's thrown a touchdown for every 102 passing yards. The league average this season is a passing touchdown for every 171 passing yards. Now, Purdy might be more efficient in that yards to touchdowns conversion because of the weapons that he has at his disposal. He's working with some good pass catchers, but it's still something that's noteworthy. But here's the thing. It's not like he can't sustain something like that over the next 2 weeks, right? It's just 2 games. And in those 2 games, he gets the Commanders and the Raiders. You might not want to play him against Washington. They're a below average matchup, but the Raiders are a top 5 matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So maybe you don't want to play Purdy this week as a streamer, but next week, he's definitely in play. Hold Jamaal Williams. Jamaal Williams was looking good for a while, but regression was inevitable. After scoring 12 times on the ground across his first 10 games, Williams has found the end zone just twice over his last 4. And he hasn't finished higher than RB30 in weekly scoring in any of those games. He has just 7 PPR points over his last 2. Because in those last 2, he hasn't found the end zone. He is quite literally the definition of touchdown dependent. Now, does that mean that you drop him? Probably not. Because we know that he has multi-touchdown upside each week. And Detroit has 2 good matchups against the Panthers and Bears to close out the fantasy season. So you might not want to play Williams depending on your roster, but you can't give your opponent an opportunity to have him either. Add Gardner Minshew. So it was reported on Monday that Jalen Hurts has a sprained shoulder. He could miss the next 2 weeks, if not more. Given the line movement that we've seen on FanDuel Sportsbook in that Eagles-Cowboys game, it seems highly unlikely that Jalen Hurts is going to play in Week 16. And yes, it sucks. Considering the infrastructure in Philadelphia and the fact that we've seen Gardner Minshew succeed in the past, he seems like a decent streaming option this week, and potentially moving forward. Dallas is coming off a game where they didn't look great defensively against Trevor Lawrence, who was a top 5 option against them, and Philly's team total right now is still over 20 points. I personally would rather risk it with Minshew in a good offensive environment than someone like Kenny Pickett or Tyler Huntley in a plus matchup. Add the Los Angeles Chargers defense. Yes, I know this transaction has happened before. This is the 3rd time I'm talking about the Chargers defense on this show. But their percent roster number is not going up. So I have to call them out again. Because over their next 2 games, they get the Jonathan Taylor-less Colts and then the Rams. Those are 2 top 5 matchups for fantasy defenses. So add the Chargers defense this week. Add the Detroit Lions defense. So the Lions defense has actually been low-key dominant for fantasy purposes. Over their last 7 games, they finished as a top 8 fantasy defense in 5 of them. As you've probably heard by now, because everyone's talking about the Lions, they have a cakewalk scheduled to end the year. In week 16 and 17, they get the Panthers and the Bears. Those are 2 top 10 matchups by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So you could hypothetically ride the Lions defense through the end of the fantasy season. Add the Cleveland Browns defense. So the Browns offense is playing pretty poorly with Deshaun Watson, as we know. But ever since he took over as starter, the defense has stepped up. Kind of. We have to be aware that the Browns have faced Kyle Allen and Tyler Huntley in 2 of their last 3 games. The 3 games where Deshaun Watson has been starter. Most defenses would come through and have good fantasy performances against those quarterbacks. But with that being said, their game against the Saints this week, not bad. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, Cleveland's a 3-point home favorite. And this game has a 34.5 point over-under. For real. And the reason for that is that it looks like there's going to be bad weather up in Cleveland this weekend. So given that low over-under, given they're playing at home, I think they make a ton of sense as a streamer this week. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com for everything I'm offering. Otherwise, thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.